It's funny how, when we think of the grandeur of Rome, we immediately think of emperors, battles, and coliseums, but we almost never think of those who truly sustained this empire, the fishermen. And herein lies the contradiction. They were invisible, almost despised, but without them the empire simply wouldn't eat. Strange, isn't it? The most basic food, fish, was at once a luxury for the elite and a source of survival for the people. Few people imagine that before each banquet there were men mending nets by moonlight, entire families immersed in the smell of salted fish, and even children working so that Rome would have the energy to conquer the world. This detail, which seems boring and monotonous, actually holds one of the most surprising stories of antiquity. The curious thing is that this topic makes us wonder, don't we today also depend on invisible workers who rarely receive credit, but without whom our routines would fall apart? Perhaps your food today has a history as hidden as the Roman fish. So get ready, we're going to travel through centuries to discover how the tedious but essential life of fishermen shaped the most powerful empire in history. A slow, almost sleepy narrative, but full of details that will keep you hooked until the end, or perhaps lull you into a deep sleep. Now tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it there? I'd love to know where this story is going right now. In the vast Roman Empire, fish wasn't just a food, it was a symbol of everyday survival. It appeared on the tables of both rich and poor, whether as a main course or mixed into simple sauces. Imagine an ordinary morning, fishermen bringing in full nets, while the markets filled with strong aromas, reminding us that this food would be the day's fuel. Interestingly, even in regions far from the sea, fish found its way onto plates, carrying with it the salty taste of the Mediterranean water. The curious thing is that while today we have refrigerators and freezers that store everything effortlessly, back then every fish had to be consumed quickly or preserved in salt. This made fish an affordable but also strategic food. It was both common and valuable. Have you ever thought that without fish, a large part of the population would be without one of the main sources of protein? It's like imagining rice or beans disappearing from our tables today. And there was something fascinating about this. Fish adapted to every table. The poor ate dried sardines, simple and salty, while the elite savored more refined dishes with sauces scented with herbs. This versatility created a bridge between social worlds that rarely met. In a Rome of such stark inequalities, it was curious to think that a single food united so many people, each in their own way. If you pay attention, the logic hasn't changed all that much. Today, fish still fulfills this ambiguous role. It can be found fried at the market, served in popular dishes, but it also appears on the sophisticated menus of luxury restaurants. In both cases, it maintains this aura of simplicity, yet prestige. Fish, in essence, has always been democratic, but its importance went beyond flavor. It was a matter of health and sustenance. And that's not all. There was also a symbolic and religious aspect to fish consumption. Many Romans believed that certain fish brought luck, healing, or even a connection with sea deities. Eating fish, therefore, wasn't just about satisfying hunger, but in a way, participating in a silent ritual of connecting with the natural world. This spiritual dimension of food shows how something simple can carry profound meanings. Interestingly, this centrality of fish paved the way for other food revolutions within the empire. Garum, for example, that strong aromatic sauce made from fermented fish innards, began to become popular among the Romans, and from then on, fish ceased to be just a food and became a valuable commodity. But that's another part of the story. which will be revealed little by little. When one thinks of fishing in ancient Rome, the Mediterranean immediately comes to mind, that immense, vibrant sea that seemed endless. Their small, fragile boats cut through the waves daily, bringing with them not only fish but also stories of courage and survival. It was like an eternal stage, where each dawn heralded the struggle for survival. The smell of the sea mixed with salt permeated clothing and bodies, becoming almost an invisible uniform for the fishermen. But it wasn't just the sea that pulsed with life. Rivers like the Tiber, which snaked through Rome, were equally vital. Their waters offered smaller but constant supplies of fish, supplying the heart of the city. The routine there was almost mechanical. Cast the net, wait, reel in, repeat. If you've ever watched someone fishing by a river today, you know there's something hypnotic about this cycle. It was the same one the Romans experienced, a calm, yet necessary repetition. Lakes also had their importance. Imagine entire villages living around a lagoon, where the moon's reflection provided companionship for nocturnal fishermen. In these calmer waters, there was no danger of sea storms, but rather the silent patience of wait. And curiously, the fish from these lakes fed not only the local population, but also traveled in salty barrels to other cities. Each region had its own character and flavor. The Mediterranean represented abundance and risk, the rivers constancy, the lakes serenity. This diversity ensured that the empire always had fish available, something that in times of meat scarcity was seen almost as a blessing. It's interesting to consider how we also seek this diversity today, from Japanese sushi to northeastern grilled fish. The sea and fresh water still connect us through the table, and there was also trade between these regions. Fish that were abundant in the south could travel north, crossing busy roads and ports. This transit created not only wealth, but also cultural exchange. Eating fish from another region was in a way tasting a distant corner of the empire, and this idea of tasting the taste of the world remains alive today when we try imported or exotic dishes. All of this shaped not only the economy, but also Roman customs and imagination. Fish wasn't just what was caught, it was also what was traded, shared, and circulated in travel stories. And as trade grew, so did the need to better preserve the catch. A challenge that would lead the Romans to some very curious practices. Among the many flavors that circulated throughout the Roman Empire, some fish became true stars of the table. Tuna, for example, was a favorite, strong, nutritious, and abundant in the Mediterranean. It was seen as a food of endurance. Imagine a Roman soldier after a long march being given dried tuna fish to regain strength. The taste was simple, but it represented vigor, just as we feel today when eating something that gives us instant energy, like a cereal bar after a workout. Eel had a special charm. With its tender flesh and distinctive flavor, it was appreciated by all walks of life. Some saw it as a festive dish, others as an everyday meal. Its preparation could vary: roasted, boiled, or dipped in thick sauces. It's curious to think that, in many regions of the world, eel still carries this aura of refinement. Anyone who has tried sushi knows well, it has a unique flavor sensation that surprises even the most discerning. Sardines, in turn, were the people's favorite. Small, cheap, and plentiful, they were always present on the humblest table. Sun-dried, salted, and stacked in barrels, they could be transported long distances without spoiling. They were the Romans' bread and butter, that food that never runs out, eaten quickly, without fuss, but that sustained. To this day, a simple grilled sardine brings back memories of oaring, a full table, and simplicity. Sturgeon, rare and prized, was associated with luxury. Its firm meat and roe were highly coveted, even offered as gifts to important figures. It was, in a sense, the caviar of the Roman. Eating sturgeon wasn't just about nourishment, it was about affirming status. This logic remains alive. We still associate certain dishes with wealth, not so much for their flavor, but for their symbolism of exclusivity. This variety shows that fish, besides being essential, had a social spectrum from the humblest to the noblest, everyone found in the sea, and fresh water a food that suited their budget and taste. And this revealed a powerful characteristic of Roman society, the ability to transform something so simple into a marker of social standing, a reflection that still echoes in our relationship with food today. However, for these fish to circulate and reach our tables, there was a crucial question to be solved: how to ensure they would withstand the test of time and distance. After all, without a refrigerator, preserving fish was an art in itself, and one that would pave the way for techniques that would change Roman commerce itself. Fish, curious as it is, had the ability to transit between very different worlds within the Roman Empire. For the common people, it was their daily food, bought in small pieces or in barrels of salted sardines. It was what sustained the laborer who spent the day carrying stones or cultivating the land. For the elite, fish was synonymous with refinement, served fresh, prepared with herbs and spices. It decorated luxurious tables. It's interesting to see how the same food took on such distinct guises. In the humblest homes, meals were almost always quick: rustic bread, cheap olive oil, and dried fish. This trio nourished tired bodies, but also gave a sense of belonging, of a full stomach. In palaces, banquets featured enormous tuna, exotic eels, and refined garum sauce. It wasn't just about flavor, it was about spectacle. Eating fish, among the elite, was almost a way of displaying power, like someone today who orders expensive champagne just to impress others. This contrast made it clear that food was not just a matter of survival, but also of status. It's like thinking about coffee. For some, it's just a quick cup in the morning. For others, it's a ritual, with imported beans and artisanal preparation. Fish in ancient Rome followed this same logic. The same species that fed slaves could also shine on a senator's table. What changed was the context, preparation, and manner of consumption. But there was something in common. In both classes, fish brought a sense of connection to the sea and its abundance. It was as if, when eating, everyone was connected to that invisible network of fishermen, boatmen, and traders who made food possible. Even those who had never seen the Mediterranean could taste it in the saltiness of the food. This invisible connection is something we still feel today when tasting something that comes from far away, like Swiss chocolate or Colombian coffee. Interestingly, this balance between the popular and the luxurious also generated tension. Some criticized the excesses of the elite, saying they turned simple food into excess. Satirical writers mocked the lavish tables where a single fish could cost more than a worker's salary in weeks. This shows how even food could be the target of social criticism. After all, where there is inequality, even a fish dish can become a symbol of contention. And amidst this duality, a practical question arose that no one could ignore. How could fish so perishable be distributed on a large scale, reaching both the poor in the villages and the wealthy in the cities? This question led directly to one of the greatest Roman ingenuities, the art of preserving and transporting fish efficiently. In Roman daily life, salt was much more than a seasoning. It was a true guardian of food. When it came to fish, it became indispensable. Without the refrigerator we have today, salt was the only resource capable of preventing food from spoiling quickly.
Thus, each grain represented time, time for the fish to travel dusty roads, time for it to reach distant regions of the sea. It was, in a way to extend the life of food. The process was simple but laborious. Fishermen cleaned their fish, dipped them in layers of coarse salt, and then stored them in wooden barrels. This technique transformed what would otherwise be perishable into a product that lasted almost forever by the standards of the time. It was the Roman miracle against the clock of decay. Anyone who has ever eaten sun-dried meat or dried cod knows well the durability that salt provides, and in essence, the Romans did the same, and there was an economy around it. Salt so valuable was taxed, traded, and even used as a form of payment. It's no wonder the word salary comes from this. It's interesting to think that fish preserved in salt fed both common workers and soldiers on military campaigns. Imagine a legionary crossing distant lands, eating salted fish wrapped in bread. It wasn't a tasty meal like a banquet, but it was durable, practical, and sustained entire battalions. This custom also had a cultural impact. The strong smell of salted fish permeated the markets, impregnating clothing, walls, and even streets. Many writers of the time mocked this, saying it was impossible to walk through certain areas without smelling the penetrating odor. Today, it might seem strange to us, but it was a smell of survival, abundance, and life in motion. For them, what was bothersome was also a sign of prosperity. At the same time, this practice revealed Roman ingenuity in dealing with limitation. Transforming something as fragile as fish into a durable commodity required patience, knowledge, and discipline. It was as if each barrel of salted fish was a promise of a secure supply. To us, accustomed to freezers and vacuum packaging, it may seem trivial, but at the time it was almost cutting-edge technology, and each barrel represented more than food. It was also logistical power, and it was precisely this power of preservation that paved the way for large-scale trade. Fish ceased to be merely a local staple and became an exportable product within the empire itself, and along with fish, a certain sauce that would become famous and controversial began to gain prominence. Garum, made from fermented fish in the coastal cities of the Roman Empire, markets were veritable theaters of daily life. At dawn, fishermen would arrive with their boats, bringing in the previous night's catch. The hubbub began early, voices announcing prices, buyers haggling, and the clink of coins echoing between wooden stalls. The smell of fresh fish mixed with sea salt permeated the air, creating an atmosphere that might seem uncomfortable to us today, but which, for them, was synonymous with abundance and plenty. The stalls displayed rows of fish, still glistening, their scales shining in the sunlight. Children ran between the aisles, curious, while women carefully examined the freshness of each animal. The vendors, with calloused hands and soaked clothes, knew time was short. The fish needed to be sold quickly, before the heat of the day compromised its quality. It was a dynamic trade, almost a daily spectacle, where every second counted. This noisy environment contrasted with the peaceful life of villages far from the sea, where fish only arrived salted or fermented. In coastal cities, however, freshness was a privilege. Eating fish caught that very morning was a cherished experience. It's like going to the market today and choosing fruit directly from the producer.
The feeling of proximity to the source adds a new flavor to the meal, in addition to instilling confidence in the quality of what you take home. And of course, markets weren't just places for buying and selling. They functioned as social gathering places. People exchanged news, made trade deals, organized weddings, and discussed politics. The fish trade provided the backdrop for conversations that shaped community life. It was, a sense, an invisible network that linked fishermen, traders, and consumers, all dependent on one another. The elite also frequented these markets, albeit more discreetly. Servants were sent to select the best fish,
destined for the sophisticated kitchens of the mansions. This generated a certain amount of competition. The common people often got the leftovers, while the larger, more beautiful pieces went to the tables of the wealthy. This detail reinforced how social inequality was present even in the markets, even though everyone was surrounded by the same strong smells and the same stalls. And as this trade grew, an even greater challenge arose: how to quickly transport this fresh fish to more distant cities, where the sea was only a distant memory. This question would give rise to ingenious solutions that went far beyond fishing nets, involving roads, vessels, and complex trade routes. The Roman fishermen's boats were humble, but they carried within them the essence of survival. Built of wood, unadorned, they were shaped to withstand the sea, but not to dazzle. They were fragile, creaking as they rocked in the waves, and emitted that characteristic smell of resin and salt. Nothing compared to the luxurious vessels used by the elite for leisure, but they were still faithful companions to those who depended on fishing for their livelihood. These small vessels lacked comfortable space. Fishermen spent hours standing, wearing wet clothes and bare feet, braced against the rough planks. The sound of water lapping against the hull was constant, and the cold wind bit at dawn. Imagine this scene. Instead of waking up and enjoying a hot coffee as we do today, Roman fishermen began their day by braving the sea, with an empty stomach and the uncertainty of what they would bring home. The small size of the boats required cooperation. Many fishermen organized themselves into pairs or small groups, sharing the effort of rowing and casting nets. Every movement needed to be synchronized, because any mistake could mean losing the catch, or worse still, falling into the icy water. It was a silent choreography honed by habit that made these boats not just tools, but extensions of the very body of those who piloted them.
Compared to merchant ships, these boats seemed like toys, but their simplicity was also their strength. They could enter shallow areas, approach rocks, and explore nooks and crannies where fish hid. It was the difference between a luxury car and a bicycle. Each serves its purpose, but it's the bicycle that reaches the narrow alleys where no other car can enter. The fishermen knew this and exploited every advantage their modest boats offered. Wear and tear, however, was inevitable. The wood swelled, cracked, and required constant repair. Often the fishermen themselves, lacking the money to hire skilled craftsmen, improvised repairs with ropes, salvaged nails, and scraps from other abandoned boats. The relationship with the weather also brought lessons in humility. No matter how much planning was done, the unexpected always arose. This dependence forced fishermen to develop patience and resilience. It's curious how this still holds true today. We can prepare a project perfectly, but all it takes is an external detail, the economy, a crisis, even an unexpected delay, to change everything. Life, deep down, remains a sea with its own moods. Fear was a constant companion. Imagine yourself in a small wooden boat, the wind roaring, the waves rising like walls all around. In those moments, the Roman fishermen thought not of profit or abundance, but only of returning alive. The smell of the storm, the salt water hitting his face, the shouts among his companions. All this created a scenario in which courage was tested daily. It was life pitted against the immense forces of nature. Still, there were those who risked going out even in the unstable weather. Necessity prevailed. A family man couldn't simply wait for better days if his children were starving. This courage mixed with desperation was part of the routine for men. And, in a way, this dilemma has spanned centuries. How often do we still see people working at risk because they simply have no other option? And yet, when the weather was favorable and the fishing was plentiful, the reward came in the form of celebration. The return to port with loaded boats was marked by joy and relief. But this euphoria was short lived because everyone knew the next day could be completely different. It was a life of constant instability, always teetering on the edge between plenty and scarcity. And when the worst happened, what surfaced was the greatest risk of all: shipwreck. For the Roman fishermen, the sea was never just a source of sustenance, it was also a silent enemy, always ready to unleash its fury. Storms arose without warning, transforming the calm of the early morning into a scene of chaos. The wind roared like a wild beast, the waves rose like walls, and the small wooden boat seemed like a toy about to be swallowed. At such times, the smell of salt and the thunderous sound of the water mingled with the palpable fear of not returning home. Shipwrecks were a real, almost daily threat. All it took was a miscalculation, an unexpected gust, and entire lives were lost at the bottom of the sea. There were no life jackets, no headlights, no rescue. It was just man against the vastness. Imagine the desperation of rowing against the current, your heart racing, your throat dry, as darkness swallowed the horizon. For family members waiting on land, every delay brought the weight of uncertainty, and it wasn't just the body that suffered. The shipwreck also meant the loss of the boat, the nets, and the livelihood of an entire family. Rebuilding everything demanded time, money, and effort that few had. It was like losing, all at once, your home and your job. This constant fear molded the fishermen into resilient men, but it also made them hostage to a life of daily risks. Survival was never guaranteed. Despite this, there was a strange relationship of respect between fishermen and the sea. Danger was part of the silent pact. Those who dared to harvest from the sea had to accept its cruel rules. It's similar to what we experience today in high-risk professions, such as firefighters or miners. The danger is always there, but the greater need drives man forward. And in the case of the Romans, this push came from hunger and the promise of abundant fish. There was also a religious aspect. Many fishermen made offerings before setting sail, asking the gods of the sea for protection. Small amulets were carried in their pockets, as if they could hold back the fury of the waters. The spirituality served as a psychological anchor, a way to cope with constant fear. After all, believing someone was watching over them made the risk a little more bearable. And yet, as much as they feared the sea, the fishermen kept returning, because fish were essential, not only for their families, but for the entire empire. And even with the risk of shipwreck, the routine continued. Society viewed fishermen as essential figures, but curiously, their social prestige was minimal, almost invisible. In ancient Rome, being a fisherman brought neither honor nor recognition. Although their activity was vital to feeding the city, the fisherman was seen as someone from the lower classes, almost invisible to the eyes of the elite. While soldiers received glory for military victories and politicians for fiery speeches in the forum, the fishermen returned home in silence, carrying only the strong smell of fish impregnated on their skin and clothes. It was a profession that required sweat, but not respect. Interestingly, this devaluation contrasted with the practical importance of their work. Without fishermen, fish, an essential food, simply wouldn't reach our tables. Even so, they were treated as minor figures, often ignored in the chronicles and texts of the time. It's similar to what we see today in certain essential but underappreciated jobs. Those who collect our trash, for example, ensure our health and comfort but rarely receive applause. This social stigma also had roots in the very environment of the profession. The strong odor, the calloused hands, and the skin scarred by the sun and salt water created the image of a rough-hewn man, far from the sophistication so prized by the elite. While senators sought expensive perfumes and luxurious baths, the fisherman carried the scent of his trade on his body. It was almost as if the smell became a mark of class, a reminder of his humble position. Still, there was a certain paradox. The same fish caught by simple, undervalued hands became a delicacy when it reached the tables of noble. The elite might even despise the fisherman, but they couldn't live without the fruits of their labor. This contradiction is timeless. How often do we see luxurious products in store windows without remembering the calloused hands of those who planted, harvested, or manufactured them? The social fabric is made of these contrasts. For the fishermen, however, prestige was different. It came not from society, but from the fishing community itself. Among them there was mutual respect, solidarity, and even pride. Being a fisherman was hard, but it was also a family legacy, a tradition passed down from father to son. The value lay not in fame, but in survival, and this silent awareness of their importance sustained these men, even in the face of social scorn. This low prestige, however, highlighted another curious aspect: inequality within the fishing trade itself. While fishermen were barely noticed, there was a class that benefited immensely from their work: the great merchants, who transformed humble fishing into lucrative businesses. At the bottom of the chain were local fishermen who braved cold nights, torn nets, and rickety boats to make a living. They sold their catch at low prices, often pressured by the rush to prevent the fish from spoiling. Meanwhile, large merchants, owners of routes, warehouses, and contacts in the cities, bought cheap and resold at a high price. This gap created a huge gap between those who produced and those who actually profited from the fish. The sweat of many sustained the luxury of the few. The contrast was even more evident in the markets. The fishermen would arrive early, tired and wet, with makeshift barrels full of fish. The merchant, on the other hand, would appear clean, dressed in a fine tunic, simply to negotiate. One bore the burden of physical labor, the other the power of bargaining. This scene demonstrates a pattern repeated to this day. The farmer barely survives, while middlemen enrich themselves by selling fish in large urban centers. The Roman elite viewed merchants as respectable figures because they moved money and maintained contact with other markets in the empire. The fisherman, however, remained invisible, even though he was truly responsible for the final product. But it was a silent injustice, but one accepted because he was part of the social machinery. This logic is very reminiscent of today's. Often, those who appear successful are not those who produce, but those who know how to broker and sell. Traders also possessed an essential resource: logistics. They knew how to preserve fish in salt, how to transport barrels in caravans or ships, and how to distribute them to different cities. The local fisherman, confined to his village, had no way to compete. This difference made traders truly masters of the game, while fishermen were confined to daily survival. It was the difference between thinking about the present and planning for the future. However, this inequality created tension. Many fishermen complained about unfair margins, and there were reports of silent revolts, boycotts, and even conflicts in ports. But in the end, necessity prevailed. The fishermen needed to sell, and the merchant knew. It was a difficult cycle to break,
because the population's hunger kept everyone dependent on this relationship. It was almost like being trapped in an invisible net from which there was no escape, and this dynamic only became more evident when fish began to be used not only as food but also as currency. In many towns and cities, fishing became part of a parallel economic system where fish were worth as much as money. In many Roman villages, fish wasn't just food, it was currency. In regions where money was scarce, the barter system gained traction and fish became a key commodity. A barrel of sardines could be exchanged for olive oil, wine, or even simple clothing. This practice demonstrated how fish carried value beyond the table, functioning as a central element in the everyday economic machinery. It was, in a sense, the hard currency of the humblest community. Interestingly, fish had the advantage of being both readily available and durable, depending on how it was handled. Fresh, it was worth more that day. Salted, it could be stored and used later as reserve currency. It was like having a wallet with short-term bills and more durable ones. This logic allowed families to manage their livelihoods with a certain degree of flexibility, always keeping an eye on what would be most useful in exchange. These negotiations were steeped in community life. Imagine a morning when a fisherman returned from the sea and delivered part of his catch to a potter in exchange for ceramic jars, or a family offering salted fish to a peasant in exchange for wheat. These simple transactions built social bonds because they were not just business deals, but also gestures of trust. It was necessary to trust that the other would fulfill their commitment in the future. Interestingly, this form of barter economy still survives in small modern communities. Think of rural markets, where farmers exchange sacks of corn for chickens, or fishermen exchange fresh fish for fruit. The monetary system may have evolved, but the essence remains the same. In places where money is scarce, necessity breeds creativity, and direct exchange becomes the most practical response. But there were also tensions. Because fish were perishable, the fisherman needed to convince the other that the product was worth it. This created room for arguments, tough negotiations, and even distrust. After all, no one wanted to take home a fish that already smelled bad.
This vulnerability of the product required agility and at the same time social skills. The fisherman, besides knowing how to cast nets, needed to master the art of persuasion. This economic function of fish increased its importance in the empire. It ceased to be merely food and became a driving force behind social and commercial relations. And as this network of exchanges grew, the Roman state realized the need to intervene, creating oversight and regulations to control this vital trade. In the great cities of the empire, like Rome, fish could not circulate freely without the watchful eyes of the state. Supervision was strict, because food was a matter of public order. Guards and inspectors monitored the markets, ensuring that prices were regulated and that taxes reached the government. Each barrel of fish sold was more than food. It was also a source of revenue. After all, Rome sustained itself not only through wars but also through control over what reached the people's tables. The biggest concern was quality. The fish spoiled quickly, and a mistake could trigger disease outbreaks that spread throughout the city. Therefore, there were rules regarding selling hours, specific locations, and even penalties for those who tried to cheat consumers. Imagine a crowded market, the strong smell filling the air, and inspectors walking among the stalls, inspecting barrels and questioning fishermen. It was a common sight, necessary to maintain the balance of trade. Furthermore, there was the issue of taxes. The Roman state knew that where there was need, there was also opportunity for profit. The fish that entered the city paid taxes,
and part of this money went to finance construction projects, armies, and public festivals. Interestingly, this logic remains alive today. Every essential product ends up regulated and just think of the price of gasoline or bread, always controlled, always monitored by the government. This oversight also generated discontent. Many fishermen and small traders complained about the tax burden, which reduced their already meager income. To them, the system seemed unfair. They worked hard, but saw part of their profits slip away to the state. This tension between the people and the government was nothing new, but at the fish table, it became even more visible because it directly impacted families' survival. There was also the issue of corruption. Inspectors could be bribed to turn a blind eye to illegal practices, such as selling old fish as fresh or avoiding paying taxes. These hidden agreements fueled inequalities and created a shadow trade where only the most influential could gain advantage. This shows how, since the beginning, the relationship between oversight and power has been permeated by human error. Where there are rules, there are also those who try to circumvent them. And at the heart of this dynamic of control, one specific product gained increasing prominence. This sauce made from fermented fish not only generated fortunes, but also required special oversight, as its production and trade involved large quantities of fish. Among all the derivatives of Roman fishing, none achieved as much fame as garum. This sauce, made from the fermentation of fish innards, was considered liquid gold in the cuisine of the time. Fishermen often saw no value in the leftovers of their catchheads, tails, and gut, but merchants and garum producers transformed these discards into a noble product, sold at sky-high prices in cities throughout the empire. It was a clear example of how even what seemed worthless had value. Garum was in everything. It was used to season meats, vegetables, breads, and even drinks. The flavor was strong, salty, almost explosive, but the Romans loved it. It was like ketchup or fermented soybeans in our modern era, a universal condiment, present on the tables of rich and poor alike, albeit in varying qualities. Interestingly, in the 21st century, scientists and chefs are trying to recreate garum recipes, fascinated by the sauce's popularity in ancient Rome. For fishermen, garum meant a guaranteed market. Even smaller fish or parts considered useless found a profitable destination. This connection made fishing even more indispensable to the economy. After all, it wasn't just fresh fish to feed mouths, but also raw material for an entire industry. It was as if the catch had two lives, the visible one in the markets and the invisible one in the fermentation barrels. The smell, however, was a hallmark. Garum workshops exuded extremely strong odors, described by writers of the time as unbearable. Therefore, they were usually built outside the city's prime areas, near the sea or in isolated regions. Those who lived nearby knew that prosperity came with stench. It's similar to living near a factory today. The job may be guaranteed, but the smell isn't always easy to bear. And there was also the social aspect. The most expensive garums were made from prime fish, produced using more refined processes, and sold in decorated amphoras. The cheapest ones came from simple innards, destined for the common people. This contrast reinforced, once again, how even a sauce could divide social classes. The fisherman, in this context, was an essential figure, although rarely recognized as such. This link between fish and garum paved the way for the creation of truly specialized workshops, which multiplied throughout the empire and made the sauce an export product. These factories not only generated fortunes, but also changed the daily lives of the cities that housed them. Garum workshops were veritable factories in the Roman Empire, typically located near the sea. They took advantage of the abundance of fish and easy transport via sea routes. In these facilities, huge stone tanks received viscera, blood, bones, and less precious parts of the fish. Everything was covered with layers of coarse salt and left under the sun for weeks, sometimes months. The heat did the rest. Fermentation transformed what was discarded into a sauce prized throughout the empire. The atmosphere in these workshops was far from glamorous. The strong smell was almost unbearable, a mixture of salt, blood, and rot. Workers' hands were saturated with this odor, which did not easily disappear even after long baths. It was a demanding but lucrative profession. The workshop owners were often wealthy merchants, while the workers were paid little. This inequality reflected the logic of empire. Those who controlled production accumulated prestige and power. Large-scale production required organization. There were separate tanks for different qualities of garum. The most refined were made with noble fish and fermented with greater care, destined for the elite. The simpler ones, made with common scraps, were served on the table. This classification allowed for all social classes, from senators to peasants, and further expanded the product's reach. It was like wine. There were cheaper ones, and those that symbolized status. Interestingly, these workshops also created an international trade network. Garum wasn't restricted to coastal cities. It was exported in amphorae to distant regions of the empire, reaching provinces in North Africa, Hispania, and even Britain. Imagine amphorae filled with this sauce crossing seas and roads, carrying with them not only flavor, but also cultural identity. It was, in a sense, the taste of Rome, brought to different peoples. The impact of these factories went beyond the economy. They shaped the urban landscape, as they had to be located far from upscale neighborhoods. Many residents complained about the smell, but at the same time, they recognized the importance of production to the city's wealth. It was the price of prosperity, living with strong odors in exchange for financial stability and a guaranteed supply. This dilemma is similar to today's, when cities accept polluting factories in exchange for jobs. And while garum represented wealth and innovation, it also sparked controversy. Writers of the time mocked its smell, satirized its excessive consumption, and pointed out how the empire's growing dependence on this product. Garum was both loved and hated, a perfect reflection of the contradictions of Roman life. Garum workshops had a mark impossible to ignore. It was a penetrating odor, the result of fermenting fish innards mixed with salt in the heat of the sun. Anyone passing by immediately felt the heavy, almost suffocating air clinging to their clothes and body. Roman writers spared no words in describing this aroma as unpleasant, even comparing it to rot. And it was no exaggeration. Living near a garum factory was a daily challenge. Because of this inconvenience, workshops were strategically located far from the city's noblest areas. While palaces and elite homes were located in higher areas, with cleaner air and pleasant breezes, factories were located near the sea or in poorer neighborhoods. This separation highlighted social inequality. The wealthy enjoyed garum on their tables, but did not live with the burden of the smell its production generated. The discomfort was left to those with no choice. Interestingly, despite its odor, garum was considered a luxury product, a fascinating paradox. That which arose from the most intense stench became a prized, even exquisite ingredient. It's like thinking about coffee, which exudes a bitter aroma before roasting, or gorgonzola cheese, which many consider too strong, but which at certain tables is treated as a delicacy. Garum followed this same logic of contradiction. For the workshop workers, the smell was simply part of their routine. Their hands bore the invisible mark of their craft, and even after long baths, the odor persists. This detail made them easily recognizable by society, almost as if their bodies themselves betrayed their profession. It was not only a physical discomfort, but also a social stigma. Living with this smell was, in a sense, like carrying the weight of an unwanted identity. The authorities, however, tolerated this situation because they knew the economic importance of garum. Complaints arose, but they rarely resulted in change. The city's prosperity depended on its production, and the smell was considered a necessary evil. The population, resigned, learned to live with it. Just as we accept the constant noise of traffic or the pollution of large urban centers today, the nuisance became part of everyday life. This contrast between luxury and discomfort demonstrated how Roman society dealt with contradictions in a practical way. What bothered the poor fueled the luxury of the rich, and although the smell was a source of jokes, there were also more noble representations of fishing and fish in mosaics and paintings, which portrayed the craft in an almost poetic way. Despite their low social prestige, fishermen were not forgotten by Roman. Many mosaics and paintings found in homes and villages document their daily routine. Small boats, full nets, men pulling ropes under the sun. Simple scenes, yet loaded with meaning. These images reveal that, even without military or political glory, fishing was recognized as an essential part of daily life. It was art giving voice to those who often remain silent in official texts. The mosaics, with their colorful pebbles, revealed surprising details. It was possible to see the shine of the fish's scales, the weary expressions of the fishermen, and even the movement of the waves. These representations functioned almost like photographs of the time, immortalizing ordinary moments that could easily be lost in memory. For those who observed them, it was a way to appreciate the simple, remembering that their daily bread and fish came from invisible hands. In mural paintings, fish and fishing were often linked to ideas of abundance and prosperity. Wealthy homes depicted scenes of banquets, where fish dishes were served on lavish tables. In smaller villages, paintings depicted the act of fishing itself, as if it were a reminder of real life beyond the luxurious wall. It was a coexistence between the symbolic and the everyday, between the ideal of wealth and the reality of effort. Interestingly, this artistic presence brought the craft of fishing closer to the world of the gods. In some mosaics, sea deities appeared alongside fishermen, as if blessing their humble labor. This demonstrated that despite social disdain, there was a spiritual perception that the sea and its workers were part of a greater order. Fishing, in this sense, was seen not only as a necessity, but also as a divine element of life. The contrast is interesting. In practice, the fisherman was poor and little respected, but in art his image gained color, beauty, and even a certain prestige. It was as if the Romans knew, deep down, that without this invisible labor there would be no banquets or garum. Art then served as a silent record of the importance of the craft, and even today when visiting Roman ruins we can feel this respect hidden among the colored stone. These representations, however, were not limited to homes. They often appeared in public spaces, such as baths and markets, reinforcing the connection between fish and urban life. But beyond art, fishermen also played a role in rituals and festivals, where their connection to the sea was symbolically celebrated. Fishermen, though nearly invisible in everyday social life, gained prominence at certain times of the calendar. Festivals linked to the sea. On these occasions, their craft ceased to be merely a matter of survival and became part of collective celebration. Boats were decorated, nets were displayed as symbols of abundance, and fish became the main course at public banquets. It was a time when the community remembered the vital connection between the sea and life. Many of these festivals were religious in nature. Sea gods were honored, and fishermen participated in processions, carrying offerings from the water. It was common for part of the catch to be sacrificed as a divine gift in gratitude for the abundance received.
This blend of faith and routine created a link between the sacred and the everyday. The fisherman, who was normally just an anonymous worker, on these days became the representative of a greater spiritual connection. Festivals were also moments of social unity. The poor and the rich gathered around food and celebrations, albeit under different circumstances. While the elite attended rituals in prominent places, the common people savored fish prepared simply over communal bonfires. It was a rare moment when food united different social classes, and as happens even today at popular festivals, food had the power to break down barriers. There were also fishing competitions and exhibitions. Fishermen demonstrated their skills in casting nets, rowing, or even displaying special catches. These demonstrations, besides being entertaining, reinforced the value of their craft to the community. It was as if for a few hours, the fishermen emerged from the shadows to shine in the eyes of all. This temporary appreciation left a mark of pride, even if they soon returned to the anonymity of their daily work. The sounds and smells of these festivals were unmistakable.
The crackling of grilled fish, the music of flutes and drums, and laughter mixed with the roar of the waves created a vibrant scene. The aroma of fresh fish grilling over the fire wafted through the streets, inviting even the most distracted to join in. It was a sensory feast that transformed the harshness of everyday life into a fleeting celebration. For one day, the sea ceased to be a risk and became a source of joy. These celebrations, however, were not just festivals, they reinforced the presence of the gods and the importance of the sea in collective life. The fisherman, included in this ritual, was seen as a mediator between the human and the divine. But outside of these occasions, this connection remained alive in beliefs and protective deities linked to the waters. In ancient Rome, the sea wasn't just a physical space, it was also a spiritual territory. Fishermen and sailors believed that every wave, every current, and every fish was under the watchful eye of deities. Neptune, the Greek equivalent of Poseidon, was the most remembered god, revered as Lord of the Water. Before setting sail, many fishermen would say short prayers or throw offerings, asking for protection from storms and good luck in fishing. It was a way of seeking balance with the unpredictable, but it wasn't just Neptune who received lesser deities linked to rivers, lakes, and springs also played an essential role in the popular imagination. Each body of water seemed to have its own guardian entity, and fishermen respected these invisible boundaries. There were stories of cursed places where fishing was forbidden, and also of generous waters where the gods were believed to be more benevolent. This belief guided not only rituals, but also practical, everyday choices. Temples dedicated to these deities reinforced the importance of the sea in Roman life. Some ports had simple altars where fishermen lit candles or left pieces of fish as offerings. The scent of incense mixed with sea salt created an atmosphere of respect and fear. It was as if each fishing trip was also a silent negotiation with the gods. I risk my life, but I trust you will bring me back. This spiritual connection had a powerful psychological function. Faced with constant insecurity, believing in divine protection gave strength to face danger. Today, we call it faith, but in practice, it's also an emotional survival mechanism. Think of someone who carries an amulet or says a prayer before a plane trip. It's the same gesture, centuries later, to deal with the fear of the unknown. The Roman fishermen did this every morning, and of course, this religiosity also mingled with collective life. During festivals, processions honoring Neptune or local gods involved the entire community, not just the fishermen. On these days, fishing ceased to be just work and became a sacred celebration. Fish then took on symbolic meaning: food for the gods, a bridge between man and the sea. It was spirituality diluted in the most basic routine of survival. But beyond the deities, there were also specific rituals of offering fish, showing how this food became not only sustenance, but also a spiritual gift. In ancient Rome, fish wasn't limited to the table. It also had a place on altars. In many rituals, especially those associated with sea and river deities, it was common to offer fish as a form of gratitude or a request for protection. The gesture was simple, yet charged with meaning. By offering part of what sustained his family, the fisherman demonstrated devotion and confidence that the gods would return in kind, whether in abundance or safety at sea. Offerings varied depending on the region and the deity worshipped. In some coastal villages, whole fish were thrown back into the sea as a payment to the waters. In others, the fish were left on altars, accompanied by wine and olive oil, creating a blend of scents that permeated the atmosphere. This aroma, fresh fish, oil, and burning incense, transformed the ritual space into an intense sensory experience, impossible to ignore. Fish also appeared in rites linked to fertility and prosperity. Some communities believed it carried the energy of multiplication. After all, the sea seemed inexhaustible in its abundance. Couples might offer fish in search of children, and families would deposit fish to ask for abundant harvest. It was the idea that life in the waters could reflect blessings on earth. Interestingly, the symbolism of abundance still resonates today when we eat fish on holidays like Easter. In large cities, offerings took on a collective character. In public celebrations, tons of fish were sacrificed and distributed in free banquets. The population saw these events not only as a demonstration of generosity on the part of the rulers, but also as a demonstration of political power. After all, whoever could offer so many fish at once demonstrated control over essential resources. It was religion and politics walking hand in hand, lulled by the salty taste of the waters. For the fishermen, participating in these rituals had a dual value. It was both an act of faith and a form of social recognition. Even though they were a marginalized class, they became protagonists in these moments. After all, they were the ones who brought the food that became offerings. The sea and the altars met through the calloused hands of these men. This connection gave dignity to a work that during the rest of the year was little valued. However, all this ritual use of fish had a practical problem: the difficulty of storing and preserving the food for large celebrations. Without refrigeration, it took ingenuity to keep the fish in good condition until the moment of offering, and this limitation led to the development of even more elaborate preservation techniques. Preserving fresh fish in ancient Rome was a real challenge. Without refrigerators, freezers, or any modern technology, time was a constant enemy. As soon as the fish was removed from the sea, a race against the clock began. The heat accelerated the spoilage process, and it only took a few hours for the smell to betray the loss. The fisherman knew the faster he sold, the greater the profit, and the lower the risk of loss. In coastal cities, proximity to the sea made things easier, but in remote regions, the situation was much more complicated. To ensure the fish arrived in minimally acceptable condition, improvising was necessary. Many were wrapped in leaves, covered with layers of aromatic herbs, or transported in salt water. These methods helped slow decomposition, but they were far from perfect. They were at best a palliative in the face of an urgent need. The most efficient alternative was the use of salt. Fresh fish was transformed into salted fish, losing its freshness but gaining shelf life. This technique, while practical, altered the flavor and texture, meaning the fish was never consumed in the same way it was on the day it was caught. For the Romans, eating truly fresh fish was almost a luxury, reserved only for those who lived near the water or had ready access to market. This contrast shows how freshness, so commonplace to us today, was a privilege in ancient times. Today, we walk into an air-conditioned supermarket and choose fresh fish from thousands of miles away without a second thought. In ancient Rome, the simple act of eating freshly caught fish was already a rare experience, almost exclusive to coastal cities. Freshness was in itself a kind of status symbol. And then there were the inevitable losses. Many fish spoiled before even reaching market, causing losses for fishermen and traders. This constant risk was part of the business and reinforced the importance of selling quickly. It was like working with something that was worth gold in the morning, but could turn to trash by nightfall. Few commodities were so fragile. This pressure shaped strategies and accelerated the fish economy. These limitations led the Romans to develop increasingly sophisticated preservation practices, not only with salt, but also with smoking, oils, and even vinegar. Necessity, as always, drove creativity, and in this scenario, even the fishing families, women and children, played a fundamental role in preparing and preserving the fish. In the lives of Roman fishermen, fishing wasn't just a job for adult men, it was the entire family's task. Women and children actively participated, whether helping mend nets, clean fish, or transport barrels of salt. The work was arduous and began early, almost like a practical survival school. From a young age, sons learned their father's skills, casting the net, holding the oar, and distinguishing the freshness of a fish simply by looking. Women played a crucial role in this cycle. They were often responsible for preparing and preserving the fish, salting endless layers of sardines, or smoking smaller fish to prolong their shelf life. Their hands carried the intense smell of salt and fish, marks that were difficult to remove even after long baths. This feminine presence, silent and constant, was as vital as the strength of the men at sea. Without them, the gears wouldn't turn. Children, in turn, didn't have a childhood as we know it today. Between improvised games by the sea, they already became accustomed to heavy tasks, carrying baskets, organizing hooks, helping pull ropes. Often they accompanied their parents on small fishing trips, training from an early age to face the harsh sea. It was a short childhood, quickly replaced by responsibility. Learning wasn't from books, but from the rhythm of the waves and the repetition of tasks. This family involvement created strong bonds of identity. The trade wasn't just a job, it was an inheritance passed down from generation to generation. A boy who grew up surrounded by nets and boats could hardly escape this fate. Fishing shaped not only their livelihood, but also their sense of belonging. It was as if the sea called to each member of the family, transforming them into an inseparable part of their daily routine. And curiously, we still see this same pattern in traditional fishing communities today. However, this participation also exacted a high price. Women and children were exposed to long working hours, intense odors, cold, and even diseases caused by constant contact with spoiled fish or excessive salt. There was no choice. Survival required collective sacrifice. This reality reminds us that for the Romans, the luxury of extended childhood and female rest simply didn't exist among the lower classes. And this family work structure not only provided food, but also supplied entire army. Because some of the fish prepared at home, salted and packaged, ended up as provisions for soldiers on the march. It was the invisible effort of women and children indirectly sustaining the empire's military machine. The Roman legions, renowned for their discipline and conquests, marched not only with swords and shields, they also marched with food. Among the foods that sustained the soldiers, dried fish played a fundamental role. Light, durable, and nutritious,
It was easy to transport on long campaigns. Each salted morsel carried the strength of the Mediterranean waters to the empire's farthest borders. It was, in a sense, the invisible fuel of Roman conquests. Dried fish arrived at the camps wrapped in cloth or stored in barrels. The flavor was strong, salty, and often harsh, but no one complained. For an exhausted soldier after crossing mountains or facing battle, that food represented survival. It's like modern military rations, designed not to delight, but to keep the body strong and ready to fight. Fish fulfilled this role with surprising efficiency. The curious thing is that this military supply directly connected humble fishermen with the great Roman war machine. Men who never left their villages, who barely knew anything beyond the sea, fed soldiers in distant lands like Germania or Britannia. It was an invisible but powerful chain. The efforts of an anonymous fisherman sustained victories that would change the fate of entire nations. The logistics of this transportation were complex. Roman roads, merchant ships, and caravans were involved in the process of transporting dried fish thousands of kilometers away. This effort required almost industrial organization. With each campaign, tons of fish were prepared and distributed, demonstrating how fishing was not just a local activity, but a vital cog in the imperial machinery. It was, literally, the sea fueling the war. This link between the sea and the army also reinforced the strategic importance of fish. If supplies failed, soldiers went hungry, and military efficiency declined. Therefore, ensuring sufficient dried fish was as important as manufacturing weapons. This interdependence raised, albeit indirectly, the value of fishermen's work. Even without metals, they were an essential part of the conquests. Without fish, no empire could survive, and of course this large-scale circulation was only possible because maritime trade expanded and strengthened. Fish, previously restricted to coastal villages, now crossed oceans and reached distant regions, becoming a link between the sea and Rome's military glory. Roman maritime trade was one of the empire's most impressive mechanisms, and fish played a prominent role in this network. Ships laden with salty barrels crossed the Mediterranean, transforming seas into veritable supply highways. What had previously been local consumption, limited to coastal villages, now reached distant provinces, where the sea was only a distant memory. Fish thus became a bridge between peoples, cultures, and economies.
The logistics were immense. In busy ports like Ostia near Rome, ships unloaded tons of salt-preserved fish. From there, carts followed the empire's paved roads, carrying the product to inland cities. This integrated system allowed even those living far from the sea to experience the salty taste of the waters. It was like having a modern distribution network, but built with boats, amphorae, and stone roads. This expansion also favored parallel trade. Merchants took advantage of the growing demand and created alternative routes, diverting cargo to specific regions. Fish became a strategic commodity, sought after and, in many cases, monopolized by those with the most resources. The simple fishermen, once again, watched from afar, while large-scale traders grew rich through distribution on an imperial scale. It was a power game, sustained by the invisible labor of the humble. Interestingly, fish also became a cultural ambassador. An amphora of garum sent from Hispania carried not only flavor, but also local identity. Eating fish or sauce from another province was in a way experiencing a piece of that territory. Thus, maritime trade not only provided food, but also connected different parts of the empire, creating a sense of belonging that transcended borders. But this system was not without its risks. Pirates, storms, and shipwrecks could disrupt trade routes and cause sudden shortages in regions dependent on fish. Therefore, Maritime trade required not only nautical skill but also protective strategies. Escorting ships, reinforcing ports, and monitoring routes became essential practices to keep the system running. Without these practices, the empire risked starvation, even surrounded by sea. And with the expansion of trade, rivalry also grew between local fishermen and foreign traders arriving at the ports. This social tension demonstrated that fish was not just food or merchandise, but also a source of economic conflict and disputes over space. In Roman ports, where the smell of fish mingled with the salt and the roar of the waves, there was also the scent of competition. Local fishermen viewed with suspicion the arrival of foreign traders, who brought unusual fish or bought in bulk to resell at a profit. The scene was common. A humble fisherman would return tired from the sea, only to discover that foreigners had taken over the best areas of the market, attracting customers with more varied prices or products. This rivalry was not only economic, but also cultural. Foreigners often had different trading methods, used different currencies, and even spoke with accents that sounded strange to locals. This created a sense of threat to the fishing community's identity. The market, which should have been a space of exchange and abundance, became a stage for tension, cross glances, and heated arguments over who had the right to sell. Foreign traders, in turn, were not there by chance. They knew the value of fish and saw opportunities for wealth in Roman ports. They arrived with larger boats, different preservation techniques, and broader networks. Faced with this, the local fisherman, limited to his village and traditional methods, felt at a disadvantage. It was a struggle between tradition and innovation, where survival depended on resisting change. These tensions even led to direct conflicts. There are records of violent arguments and even boycotts against foreigners trying to establish themselves in certain ports. Fish, such a simple food, became a source of fierce competition. It's curious to think how this continues today in small fairs and large markets, when local producers complain about competition from imported products that arrive at lower prices. The logic is the same, only the context changes. However, this rivalry also brought indirect benefit. The clash between locals and foreigners generated innovation, conservation techniques, transportation methods, and even culinary recipes intermingled in these environments, creating new possibilities. Paradoxically, the conflict also produced learning. Local fishermen could resist, but they often ended up absorbing the practices of outside traders, strengthening their own work. Still, the distrust never completely disappeared. For the Roman fishermen, the sea was enemy enough. Competing on land with foreign traders was yet another burden, and as this dispute continued, writers and ordinary citizens began to notice another problem with fish markets: the intense odor, which spread through the streets and generated constant complaints. For many Roman writers, walking through fish markets was almost an assault on the senses. The strong odor mixed with the heat, impregnating clothes and beards, making the presence of this trade impossible to ignore. Some texts describe the smell as unbearable, comparing it to rot. It was common for the elite to mock these environments, transforming the odor into a symbol of vulgarity. The fish, which fed thousands, also bore the mark of discomfort. These complaints reveal a lot about the mentality of the time. For the wealthy, sensory discomfort was a source of contempt, even though they were the largest consumers of the product. They wanted fresh fish on their tables, but without having to deal with the smell of the market. It was the old contradiction, enjoying the benefits, but rejecting the process. How often do we see something similar today when we buy packaged food without considering the hard work behind it? Satirical writers were even harsher. They used the smell of markets as a metaphor to criticize corruption, decadence,
or the lack of refinement in society. The stench of fish became an allegory for the ills of Rome. It's interesting to see how something so banal in everyday life was elevated to a moral symbol, proof that even odors can carry social and political meanings. The fish market was not only a physical place, but also a literary resource for fishermen and traders. However, the smell was no laughing matter. It was simply a part of life. It represented sustenance, work, and survival. Their accustomed noses failed to notice the nuisance that so irritated the elite. This difference in perception created an invisible barrier between classes. What was a stench to some was a sign of prosperity to others. It was like hearing the constant dun of a factory, a nuisance to some, music to those who depend on it. These criticisms, however, did not diminish the importance of the fish trade. On the contrary, they reinforced the need to better organize markets, creating specific spaces, often far from the wealthy neighborhood. The city adapted to the smell, trying to contain it but never managing to eliminate it completely. The odor, after all, was inseparable from the fish, and the fish was inseparable from Roman life. It was a price everyone had to pay, and despite the complaints, the fish trade remained strong, spanning centuries. But, like so many other practices, it too would face radical changes over time. With the fall of the empire, some fishing traditions began to change, and in many places disappeared. With the fall of the empire, many structures that sustained Roman fishing began to crumble. Trade routes, once safe and protected by roads and military ships, became vulnerable to looting and invasion. Once bustling ports lost their vitality, and markets that depended on salted fish or garum no longer received supplies. What remained was local fishing, limited to communities that could survive without the imperial distribution network. It was the beginning of a slow decline. Garum workshops, once symbols of wealth and international trade, virtually disappeared. Without political stability and guaranteed routes, large-scale production lost its meaning. The strong smell that once dominated entire neighborhoods faded, replaced by silence and ruins. Garum, so beloved by the Romans, fell into oblivion, becoming only a memory recorded in ancient texts and amphora fragments. Even everyday fishing underwent changes. Without the central power to regulate prices, collect taxes, and maintain order, each community began to rely on its own practices. Fish remained a staple of the diet, but on a much smaller scale. International trade gave way to local exchanges, and sophisticated conservation techniques were abandoned in many regions. It was as if the sea had shrunk, returning to being merely a source of immediate subsistence. This decline also had social repercussions. The already low prestige of fishermen was further diminished, as the trade was no longer connected to large economic networks. The medieval fisherman inherited the waters, but no longer the imperial importance. His life was limited to feeding his own community, without the feeling of participating in something grand. Fish, once the engine of empire, was now merely a simple source of sustenance, almost invisible in history. Still, we can't speak of a total disappearance. Many practices survived in small villages and coastal communities. Rudimentary nets, wooden boats, family fishing, all of this continued, spanning generations. It's thanks to this persistence that centuries later, we still find similarities between Roman fishermen and today's artisanal fishermen. The tradition hasn't died out. It's simply transformed into a more modest shadow of its former splendor. And this cycle of rise and fall shows how even the most solid customs are subject to time and the changes of history. The sea remained there, infinite and generous, but the way men exploited it would never be the same. And now, having covered this entire journey of the lives of Roman fishermen, It's time to step back and prepare an introduction that connects this journey with today's view. And now that you've seen the behind the scenes story of Roman fishermen, you might realize something curious. Great empires aren't sustained solely by soldiers and generals, but by invisible, calloused hands that do the work no one applauds. The question is, who are the fishermen in your life today? The ones you barely notice, but without whom nothing works. If we stop and think about it, even our modern routines are made up of people and details we rarely acknowledge. The driver who wakes up at dawn, the farmer who plants the rice you eat, or even you yourself, shouldering responsibilities few appreciate. What would happen if this silent work disappeared? And what's more, how can you apply this reflection to your own life? Are you valuing the little things that sustain you enough? Or are you, like many Romans, distracted only by the superficial spectacle without looking at what truly matters? I want you to challenge yourself. If you were in the shoes of a Roman fisherman, would you have the courage to leave at dawn, face storms, and still return home unrecognized? And most importantly, in your current life, where have you been living as an invisible fisherman? And where have you been living as a merchant reaping the rewards? Answer me in the comments, because I really want to know which part of this story caught your attention the most. And of course, don't forget, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you can continue learning from me about stories that seem boring but hide profound lessons.